This is an overview of the Caliburn and Downclaw Slamfire kit development process. Super exciting stuff, I know. So here at the beginning of the video, you can see the first prototype of the Slamfire kit. This was the proof of concept. It had a lot of supports, and it was printed at 100% infill, and it had a lot of stuff wrong with it. Instead of having proper pivot points, the sear and the trigger arm used screws. And instead of using a rubber band for the sear, that hole in the top middle of the big slot is where a screw went in and held in place an extension spring. Here you can see my attempt at a stabilization tab, and that's about it for that prototype. Here you can see the first trigger arm, and it's not very beefy, and it's very thin at the front. In fact, it's sloped and thin on the front. That was to get around a curve issue with the first one that was fixed in later designs to have more space. This version used standard Caliburn sears, just like all the other versions. Here you can see my next major prototype. This one was also for the Caliburn U, just like the previous one. This one I tried printing it vertically, which resulted in a fragile print. It also has an integrated Picatinny rail, which is too low down to actually use for most things, because it would hit against the rest of the Slamfire bit. As you can see here, because of the vertical printing, it snapped off the bit that holds the sear in place. Well, it snapped off everything around it, but it still worked, surprisingly. This is what I did my K14 durability test with. And that snap happened before I even tried that, and it held up great. Here you can see the first prototype of a Talon-Claw version. You can see that this is also printed at high infill with the same black filament. This one is the first instance of the individual rail with the slot that the threaded rod locks it into. This version used a screw on each side of the trigger arm to pivot on, just like the previous versions, but the back used a removable pivot pin with a screw holding it in. You can see here the different revisions of trigger arm, starting with the super thin one, and then the later ones are thicker. And then I started fiddling with the amount of tab on the back that presses down on the sear to make it more reliable. Along with the little tab of polycarbonate that actually hits the ram base. That was later switched to PVC because polycarbonate eventually snaps. PVC pipe does not. Here you can see the first version with a location tab on the side. This version uses removable pins for both pivot points. It retains the removable rail. Here are the pivot pins. As you can see on the right, that little lump right above where my finger is, that's the location hole. That goes into the coupler part of the Talon-Claw U, or Talon-Claw, to keep it aligned. Here is the first Takedown version of the Talon-Claw kit, with a removable pivot pin that is held in place with a standard takedown pin. That is done to remove the trigger arm because it normally covers the takedown slots of a standard Talon-Claw or Caliburn. Here's my first attempt at making a fully printed version of the Kiri part with a slot cut out of it, and my first attempt at a location tab, which was a screw. That did not work well. Not strong enough. Here is a much more recent version. As you can see, the removable rail slot is still there. And it has a revised screw-in pin for the sear, and the takedown pin you can see there with a cotter pin to keep it in place since I drilled it out a little bit too thin. This takedown pin is printed flat instead of vertically, and that's to keep the layer lines aligned so it's nice and strong. As you can see here, it still uses a PVC tab to actually hit the ram base. And that is done both for durability and so you can adjust how far you want the activation to be for different sized ram bases. So if you have a ram base with a beveled front, you can use this version. Or if you have one that is longer, you can use a shorter tab. And here is the most recent version that I printed. There is a few tweaks on the final release, but they're just changing like the size of holes and stuff. It's nothing major. This still has the takedown front arm and screwed in back arm. This has a slightly older rail on it. I only ever printed one Talon Claw length rail, or removable rail. So that's a pretty old rail. Newer ones have slots for the screwdriver to actually get to the screw-in pins. As you can see, this version uses the location pin in the back, a little bulge, and it also has a overhang on the opposite side from the Slamfire kit to keep that aligned as well. Thank you for showing interest in the kit. I hope that you enjoy it.